It's absolutely true that DNA could never convict somebody in court, and the courts have legally found that you cannot do that. You need some other piece of evidence to bolster it up, to corroborate it.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. On the face of it, it's really quite clever. There's a knife sheath with DNA on it, but that doesn't mean you can wave a magic wand and identify the killer, voila, based on the DNA alone. For the record, DNA alone isn't enough to convict a killer or even bring charges. The Madeleine McCann case, which I'm doing a sort of pop-up series on, is an example of that. Certainly in that case, it's an example of incomplete DNA. And so if Kohberger's DNA isn't in a database, and Kohberger's wasn't, then how did they connect him to this crime? It's a clever argument superficially, and it works, sort of, because Kohberger doesn't seem to have any links to the victims. None that we know of, for sure, anyway. And isn't that a problem for the prosecution? If he has no links to them or them to him, how can there be a motive? Let's break it down. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. I will be doing a follow-up to this where we'll just explore the DNA narrative in a little bit more detail. If you're enjoying this episode, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. So let's talk about guilty knowledge. That's one of the tests, one of the signs that prosecutors look for. How is there a change in behavior subsequent to a crime? And do we see any of that here with Kohberger? So what we're going to do in terms of addressing this question about the DNA and, how did they connect him? Let's jump completely out of the timeline for a moment. Let's jump right out of the contextual framework, because we need to address that question. But let's just put it to the side for a few minutes, okay? Now, if we jump ahead to Kohberger cleaning his vehicle while wearing surgical gloves and running around at 4 a.m. secretly disposing of garbage on a neighbor's property, all of this is barely a month after the murders. One has to ponder, what normal, innocent person has ever done this around Christmas time? I mean, he seemed to be doing everything possible to prevent investigators from getting his DNA. And isn't this because he knew he'd left the sheath behind? And isn't this because he feared he'd left his DNA behind on the sheath, which, by the way, he did? Also, did you know that when Kohberger was arrested, he was caught by surprise? According to the first assistant district attorney in Monroe County, that's in Pennsylvania, they said that when authorities entered Kohberger's parents' home at about 1:30 a.m., it's a surprise arrest very early in the morning. Guess what? They found him in the kitchen wearing latex gloves and placing trash in Ziploc bags. Who does that? Is that a sign of guilty knowledge? And so the first district attorney, Mancuso, told BRC 13, quote, Mr. Kohberger was found awake in the kitchen area, dressed in shorts and a shirt, and wearing latex medical-type gloves, and apparently was taking his personal trash and putting it into separate Ziploc baggies. And then what do you think he would do with that? Well, I would suggest that he would go and drive to a separate area like a garbage dump and dump them there. And when authorities saw the suspect doing this, they suddenly understood one potential reason why Kohberger's DNA was not found in the family's trash in the days prior. Quite interesting, isn't it? You may recall that they eventually linked Kohberger's DNA via his father's DNA, which was found in that trash, and only subsequently, when he was in custody, took a buccal swab, a cheek swab, and made a virtually 100% match. So if you're arguing against the DNA, you might want to ask why, at the time of his arrest, Kohberger himself seemed extremely concerned about his own DNA. So let's move now from guilty knowledge to circumstantial evidence. Although it's a half-decent argument for the defense to say that the vehicle caught on CCTV was clearly a white sedan, and who could say for sure it was an Elantra, for that matter, Kohberger's Elantra, it starts to become a facile argument when you have a white vehicle, whatever make, circling the area repeatedly as if it's lost, at whatever, 3 o'clock in the morning, very late at night, at around the time of the incident. But also prior to that, 3 or 4 times that same day, going into that day. Now, it may seem like a clever argument to dispute the make of the vehicle, but Kohberger's phone rides along with it. It's there at the same time. It's traveling in the same direction. And that can't be disproved. We know it's a phone with a particular number. We know where the phone was on the night of the murders, and we know the phone was seen where the so-called mysterious white car was seen. I also think that this argument about the DNA, it's quite interesting that they've taken how many months to field it? You would think that that would be the argument on day 1, not month 7. And obviously, where are we now? Kohberger's got to come up with an alibi. And so that's what they're thinking about. And I believe that law enforcement probably do have clearer footage of the vehicle. They simply don't want to hand it over just yet. But Kohberger needs them to do that if he's going to manufacture a half-sensible alibi. Does that make sense? Then I want to talk about no connection to the victims. I hate to say this, but do serial killers have connections to victims? So if they don't, didn't they commit a particular crime? If you can't prove a connection between a serial killer and his victims, I'm talking about some kind of elaborate dynamic, does that mean they didn't actually commit that crime or that one or that one? The point is, you don't need to demonstrate a connection in order to prove motive. But granted, in most murders, there tends to be a connection of some sort, often an emotional connection, perhaps a financial connection. That's what makes this case fairly unique and the perpetrator quite despicable, because he seems to share the trait with serial killers of choosing victims at random. The thing is, he didn't choose them at random. We know he stalked them for weeks before, and he probably was connecting with them in some shape or form on social media. And in this sense, he's not like a serial killer, in my opinion. But even if he wasn't, if we are dealing with an incel type scenario such as Elliot Rodger, then the crime isn't personal so much as symbolic. And it's this aspect that has confounded so many. And obviously, it was very personal to the perpetrator who felt alienated, rejected, humiliated, emasculated, and undermined. He was very unhappy and he wanted revenge. He wanted to take out his revenge on someone, but he didn't want to do it on his campus. If that is our profile, alienated, rejected, humiliated, emasculated, undermined, then Brian Kohberger, the student at Washington State University, is the same one who had to endure a nasty episode on his campus, bad Teachergate. He's the same one who also hit on waitresses only to have them complain. Well, he fits that profile like a hand in a glove. Even his own neighbors said they would sort of try to avoid him because once he started talking, he didn't stop. By the way, making the entire case about DNA is a clever, but it's a typical defense maneuver. It was used successfully in the John Benet Ramsey case, make the whole case about DNA. It was used successfully in the Madeleine McCann case, make it all about DNA. It was used successfully in the Amanda Knox case and arguably Suzanne Morphew as well. In the Laurie Vallow case, we saw zero DNA evidence connecting Laurie to the death of Tylee Ryan. And yet, circumstantially, it was an extremely compelling case because of her own words, her own statements, her texts, the timelines, but context and motive more than anything else. In conclusion, I've said this before, but I believe Kohberger does have a connection to one or more of the victims, but not in the way we think of a connection. In most cases, like the Corey Richards case, there's a family connection or some sort of relationship dynamic. We saw the complexities of relationship dynamics in the Laurie Vallow case. But for an incel, who's a person whose life is all about disconnection, not being part of something, a connection could be simply fixating on someone online, someone he's never actually spoken to. In his world, that's a connection. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see something like that here. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.